Hey everybody, welcome to Get Ready With Me and Talk About Stuff. My name is Stephanie. How are you today? I am so glad that you decided to join me today, and we are going to talk about some very interesting things. Before we get into that though, a couple things. If you are enjoying my videos and you have not yet subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and share the joy. Invite your friends to come join us here. The more the merrier, believe me. Also, if you would like to support future content on this show, you can do that through the links provided in the description, and I would be ever so grateful. For those of you who are new here, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This show is called Get Ready With Me and Talk About Stuff simply because that's all it is. It's not a makeup tutorial. I'm just putting on my makeup so I have something to do while I'm talking to you about whatever happens to be on my mind. And today what is on my mind are the Milgram experiments. Is or are? I don't know. I get so confused by that sometimes. It doesn't take much though, to be honest with you. So the Milgram experiments, that's what we're going to talk about today, and boy did we learn a lot through these experiments. So by the way, this is take 2 on this, so some of the stuff that you normally see me doing in the beginning I've already done, because midway through my chit chat I started dropping stuff off my little desk area here, and I'm like, this is ridiculous, so I started over. So anyway, some of it's already done. My apologies. Anyhow, so the Milgram experiments. These experiments were conducted by Stanley Milgram, who was a professor of psychology at Yale University, and the goal of these experiments was to test people's obedience. Now, these experiments were devised after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Now, Adolf Eichmann, as you might know, he was an officer. He was a Nazi, basically, and his trial was one of many after World War II, when the Nazis were asked to answer for the atrocities they had committed against other human beings, and, you know, for genocide. And his defense, as was the defense for many people who were put on trial after World War II, it was that he was just following orders. He wasn't doing this of his own volition. He was following orders, and the implication being that if the orders had not been given, he would not have done such terrible things. And that was looked to as an effort to, that's how he wanted to be exonerated. He wasn't doing it it wasn't his idea. He was just doing what he was told. So after seeing this unfold, and after years of hearing from Nazis that, you know, during World War II, they were just following orders. They were just doing what they were told. It wasn't their idea. So on and so forth. Stanley Milgram decided he wanted to test that theory. Do people blindly follow orders that are in direct conflict with their conscience? Because I think even now when we hear it, to hear somebody who's done such heinous things saying, I was just following orders, it's like, well, come on, man. Really? That's the defense you're going to go with, is you were just doing what you were told? I mean, as you killed these people, as you tortured these people, that's your defense? So the question became, is that legitimate? Do people, quote, just follow orders? You know, how far do we go in our obedience to authority? So that was the goal of these studies, was to really test that and see how far people were willing to go. So what he did to get participants is he ran an ad in the paper basically saying he invited males to come to a study at Yale University, and they were going to be studying learning. And men responded and showed up at the university lab. They were paid $4.50 just for being there. And when they arrive at the lab, they're told, you know, that money is just for showing up. You could walk out today and you'll still get paid, or you could walk out right now and you'll still get paid, but we hope you'll stay and finish the experiment. So once they arrived and they agreed to continue, what he would do is they would draw lots to decide who was going to be the teacher and who was going to be the learner. Now, unbeknownst to the people responding to the ad, it was rigged. So the person who was the learner was always going to be someone who was part of the whole experiment. It was rigged, so the learner would be one of Stanley Milgram's own people. Then what they would do, so the learner was a man by the name of Mr. Wallace. He was an older gentleman. He was probably, I believe they said he was in his 50s. And they would take him into another room, not so far away that what was happening there couldn't be heard, though. And while they're getting him set up, they would attach electrodes to his arms. And as they're setting him up, he would say things like, I'm a vet, I have got heart problems from the time that I served, or something along those lines. Basically letting people know right up front, I've got some concerns, but I'm willing to proceed with the experiment, and just asking if he would be kept safe and so forth, which of course he was told he would be. So then they would go, the experimenter, now the experimenter, this is an important part, the experimenter was not Stanley Milgram. The experimenter was someone who was dressed in a gray lab coat and would sit in the room with the teacher. And this was an actor. It wasn't somebody who was a scientist. It wasn't somebody who had any real authority. It was somebody who was in a lab coat sitting there with the teacher and just called himself the experimenter. So the experimenter would leave Mr. Wallace and then go join the teacher in that room. And then he would explain how the experiment works to the teacher. And the way the experiment worked was, the learner was going to be given a list of word pairs. And then the teacher would say one half of the pair and the learner would have to say the other. Now, if the learner got it wrong, they would receive an electric shock. And the way that worked was there was a panel, or a shock board, I think it was called, provided to the teacher and connected to the electrodes that they'd hooked up to Mr. Wallace. So, and it ranged, there were 15 different, was it 15? It might have been 30 different settings on it that ranged from a minor shock of 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. So at 15 volts, this is a very mild shock. It's not going to hurt you. And then the further up you got in the scale, there were like stickers or warnings put on it that this is a very dangerous shock, this one is severe, so on and so forth. And so it was explained to the teacher, if the learner gets something wrong, you have to shock them. And every time they get a wrong answer, you're going to increase the voltage. So if you start at 15, the next wrong answer they give you is going to be 30 and so forth. So the participants in these studies, it was 40 men who were between the ages of 20 and 50. Their education ranged from high school graduate to somebody holding a doctorate. Their employment was laborers all the way up through to professionals. So they really did their best to cover a wide range of life experiences and knowledge and attitudes when they conducted this study. So they go ahead and get started. And now the learner, of course, being somebody who is working with Stanley Milgram and is part of the experiment, he intentionally gets a lot of answers wrong, and it was designed that way. Now at first, the shocks are mild, and the learner is not really having much of a reaction to them. But then as the voltage increases, because, as I said, he's intentionally giving a lot of wrong answers, he starts to express discomfort. He starts expressing a lot of, his vocalizations become more pronounced. You can tell that these shocks are not comfortable. Now, around the 300 mark, now keep in mind, you'd have to really be dedicated even just to shock somebody up to this point, I would think. But around the 300 mark, he starts saying a script in which he says, "Get me out of here, I can't take this anymore, it's too painful, I'm worried about my heart," and so on and so forth. And then that's when the observations really started telling a story. For some of the participants, they would stop at that point. They would say, "I'm not going any further, this is harming him, I don't want to hurt the guy, I don't care about your experiment, I'm not doing any more." And this is when the responses to the teacher became a little more forceful, not merely suggesting that they continue, but they would use the following prompts. So you've got somebody who's saying, I'm not going to go forward with this. This is hurting this man. I didn't come here to hurt anybody. I'm not going to continue doing this. So at first the experimenter would say, please continue. If the teacher protested more, no, I don't want to continue. This is hurting him. I'm not doing it. The experimenter would say, the experiment requires you to continue. No, I don't want to do it. I'm absolutely not going to do this. The experimenter would then say, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And then finally, amidst further protests from the teacher, the experimenter would say, you have no other choice but to continue. Now, throughout all of this, the teacher would either be somebody who can be convinced and coerced into continuing, or there were instances where the person was like, no, I will not go any further than this. Whatever your study is about, it is not worth it to me to continue. And they would leave the experiment. There were some, however, that did continue. Now, before I tell you what the results of this experiment are, I want to tell you that Stanley Milgram did something around 18 variations of this study. There were variations conducted, much like I said, where the teacher and the learner were in separate rooms, and the teacher could hear the learner but couldn't see him, and the only person in the room with him was the experimenter, who was, of course, encouraging him to continue. They also did the experiment in such a way that they took the participants out of the setting of Yale University and put them in rundown offices. There was also a variation in which the learner and the teacher were in the same room, and the learner had to put his hand on a shock plate to receive the necessary shock. And if he did not comply with that, the learner was told to force his hand onto the shock plate. There was a variation in which the role of the experimenter was not played by an actor in a lab coat, but it was played by an actor just in plain clothes, just to see how that would affect obedience. Now, in the situations where the dynamics were changed, let me just get to that real quick here. Okay, so if the role of the experimenter was played by an actor in the lab coat, there was a high rate of obedience. And I'll give you numbers in a minute because it blew my mind when I read it. When the experimenter, part of the acting, part of the whole storyline, if you will, is that the experimenter was going to receive a phone call and have to step out of the room to take it, and somebody in plain clothes would come in and would give the same prompts. You have no choice but to continue. It is essential that you continue, etc., etc. When the plain clothes person was in the room giving the orders, the obedience fell to 20%. Now, when the experiments were conducted in rundown offices instead of the splendor of the Yale University, obedience fell to 45%. Let's see, where's the next one? I'm sorry, I lost track of what I was doing. Okay, when participants could instruct... I am so confused today. What is going on with me? Okay, so when there was one variation in which the teacher was given an assistant, and the assistant was the one who had to push the buttons or force the hand down on the shock plate or whatever. When participants, the teachers, could instruct an assistant to press the switches, shocked to the maximum 450 volts, that was 92.5% of the teachers went all the way with it, all the way up to 450 volts. When there is less personal responsibility, people are willing to do much worse things. when the teachers had to force the learner's hand down on the shock plate after they refused, after 150 volts, obedience fell to 30% because there was no longer a buffer between the teacher and their actions. And there are other variations too, and you can read about those in the links that I provide in the description. However, this is the, no pun intended, shocking part of the results of these experiments. So with all the variations and with all of the opportunities, teachers had to stop the experiment. 65% of teachers continued the experiment, continued administering shocks all the way up to 450 volts. Now, I don't know if you've ever watched the videos of the Milgram experiment. There are links in the description. But after about 300 volts, the learner, Mr. Wallace, makes it very clear that he is in a lot of pain. He's crying out. He's begging to have the electrodes taken off so he can get out of there. He's saying, I'm worried about my heart. Now, keep in mind, at the beginning, as I said, he had told people he has a heart condition. He doesn't know if he can take this. They're hearing this, and 65% of the teachers continued on to 450 volts. Now, I read that, and I'm like, what? Now, how could that happen? And the conclusion of the study was that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing another human being. Now, obedience to authority is ingrained. Now, this was what the study said, and I'm going to tell you what I think of this in just a moment. But the study said obedience to authority is ingrained in us all from the way we are brought up. Now, one of the criticisms of the study was that Stanley Milgram did not use a wide enough range of people. As far as there were no women who participated in the study. As far as I know, I don't know how many people of color participated. I did not read that none participated, but I do get the impression that it was limited, that this was mostly a middle-aged white male that was participating in these studies. So one criticism is he didn't include a broad enough range of experiences to really conclude that what they experienced in the laboratory can really be universally applied to everybody. And I can see that. They didn't, how would you know? Well, as it turns out, variations of this study have been performed in multiple cultures and people with different ethnicities, and the results are generally the same. So then you're left to wonder, why do people do that? Well, there are a few different theories. Some of them include, obviously if we're conditioned to obey authority, no matter what, even if it goes against our very best judgment, a person in authority can really ask you to do just about anything. Now, people who saw the experiments and saw the conclusions, it'd be easy to say that the people who did those things are just sadistic people, they're not intelligent people, and so forth. But Stanley Milgram makes a point in the video of his experiments to say that's not exactly true. You have to put into context that these people were in situations that were, they were told by a person they perceived to be an authority that they had to continue. Now, there were people, as I said, who questioned that. They're like, and what if I don't? What if I don't continue? What's going to happen if I don't? And they refused to go on. There were others who were like, okay, I'll do it because you told me I have to. Now, there was one gentleman in the experiment who really wanted to be sure that if he chose to continue, that he was not going to be held responsible for whatever happened to Mr. Wallace. And as soon as he was told by the experimenter, I will take responsibility for whatever happens, but you must continue, then he was fine with it. He was like, oh, well, if I'm not going to have to take the blame, sure, we can do this, absolutely. And that was very interesting to me. So part of the conclusions of the experiment were, As long as the person who's giving the orders is perceived to be credible and a person of authority, people are likely to do what that individual says, even if it's in conflict with their personal conscience. Now, he also suggested that there were two different states that people can be in social situations. One is the autonomous state, where they are taking full responsibility for their choices and their actions, and they're taking full responsibility for whatever the consequences are of those actions. The other is the agentic state, in which people allow others to direct their actions, then they pass off responsibility for the consequences to the person who is giving the orders. So he also suggested that two things must be present for a person to enter the agentic state. And that is, the person giving the orders must be perceived as being qualified to direct other people's behaviors, and the person being ordered must be able to believe the person in authority will accept responsibility for what happens. And I would also say, because this was in the study as well, that if that person is not surrounded by people who are willing to, quote, rebel with them, who are willing to say, yeah, I'm not cool with what you're doing here, there's also a stronger likelihood that person will just follow orders, just do as they're told, and not question it. Or even if they do question it, they'll still follow through on the orders that were given. So there's a lot happening here. So my question after reading all this, because it was shocking to see the outcome of these studies, how willing people were to cause harm to another person if they could be absolved of responsibility for it and they could just blame someone else. As I said, not every participant did that, but the ones who did, I'm watching this thinking, oh my gosh, this is just, are we really that easily manipulated? And are we that easily manipulated even in our modern times? Well, as it turns out, the answer to that is a resounding yes. It's interesting because since the time of the original studies, a lot has happened culturally and socially. There have been whole social revolutions about, down with the establishment and bucking authority and so forth. And there have been people who have really made it their mission to let the whole world know that they are not going to bow down to perceived authority figures in the United States. And as it turns out, according to the numbers, not only are we not less susceptible to that sort of blind obedience, we are in fact more susceptible to it now than we were back in the 1960s. And I'm curious as to why that is, and I have my own ideas. I think I'll share those with you when I come back. But they are, I was thinking about this a lot. Like, is there any equivalency or anything I could look to say, as an example of blind obedience to a perceived authority, despite being able to see that the thing you're in obedience to, or the person you're in obedience to, is actually causing harm? Certainly we can look at multiple cults that have cropped up and eventually fizzled out over the years, like, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Heaven's Gate, other cults that cause harm to people, but think that they are justified, and their followers think it's justified because they're just doing what someone they believe is an authority is telling them to do. They don't question it, they just do it. But I think there's another example that we can look at. And I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute when I come back. I'm going to finish up most of my eyes. I am going to use a tool that some people are asking about, and I'll use it on camera so you can see it for yourself. And as I'm doing that, I will share my thoughts with you on blind obedience to authority, even when it's in conflict with your conscience. I'll be right back. All right, I am back. So, I was going to tell you about my theories about blind obedience, etc., and so forth. So, As you probably know, if you have been with me for any length of time, I was raised in the white evangelical church. And I eventually left the church and religion altogether. But during my time there, obedience was expected. And I was thinking about that in relation to the Milgram experiments. Because so much of what he pointed out in his findings really seemed to resonate with my experience in the white evangelical church. Let me explain. So one of the things that he said was people were willing to cause harm to another person, even to the point of their death, if they believed the person giving them the orders to do so was a person in authority who warranted being listened to. Now, as you probably know, if you are living in the United States, right now, and for a long time actually, the white evangelical church has had tremendous influence on the politics under which we are all living. Not just the politics, but the decisions being made by politicians. Some of those decisions are very harmful to people. They've done things that are harmful to the LGBTQ plus community. They've done things that are harmful to Black people, Indigenous people, Latino people, people coming through the southern border, regardless of where they're coming from, etc., and so forth. And they have been told for decades now, what you are doing is harmful. You are actively harming me, you're actively harming my community, and so on and so forth. This is the tool I wanted to use on camera because people were asking about it. This is a heated eyelash curler. Anyway, and the excuse that is always given is, well, I'm just obeying God's authority. I'm just obeying what the Bible tells me. And it really absolves them of any sense of personal responsibility for the actions they take and for the consequences of those actions. And it's interesting to me because, growing up as I did in the church, I certainly fell into step pretty regularly until I got old enough to realize that what I was doing was actually hurting people, and I didn't want to hurt people, so I started rebelling against the things I was told to do. But when I was obedient, I could always just say, well, I'm just following what the Bible says, or this is what pleases God, so this is what I have to do. And I remember this specifically in relation to the LGBTQ community, of which I am part, and I know that now, but I didn't back then. And I remember specifically one of the exchange students asked me point blank, why do you hate gay people so much? And I had never thought about it until that point, that what I was doing might actually be harmful to people. It had never occurred to me that I could be doing something that measurably harmed someone else, because all I was doing was sharing what I had learned at church, what I believed the Bible said, and I was following this perceived authority to both say and do awful, awful things. I'm going to use this now. Pay attention, because I'm not going to talk about this step by step, but you'll see what I'm doing. And I still see that even now with the way, over the last 4 years when the former guy was in there, I saw many white evangelical Christians justifying the things that he said and did because they believed that he was there under God's authority. So he wasn't really responsible for anything he did because God had placed him there. Now, they, of course, did not offer the same grace to Barack Obama and other presidents that were not of their chosen political party. But with the former guy, whose name I will not even utter on my channel, The reasoning was God had placed him there, and because God had placed him there, we have to trust that what he is doing is God's will. And if you question that, that means that you are in rebellion against God himself. And I've seen this rhetoric play out again and again and again with the white evangelical community. It was happening when I was part of that community. It's happening now. And I have seen lives destroyed by these people who do awful things and say that they are doing them because under God's authority, they have to. They don't have a choice. They're just following orders. I know people who came out to their parents who were then essentially disowned, whose families basically told them, you are in violation of God's will and you're defying God's authority, and until you repent, we will not acknowledge you as one of ours. You're not my son, you're not my daughter, you're not anything to me. And proceeded to essentially shun their own children because they were doing something, or they existed in such a way that these evangelicals could not, in their minds, they couldn't allow, because it was in defiance of God's authority. I mean, certainly there are other things that we can point to as a modern example of blind obedience to an authority. I think about the cult built up around the former guy. And what's interesting to me about them is they really firmly believe that they are revolutionaries, that they are, standing in defiance of authority because they perceive authority to mean liberal. But still blindly following anything the former guy says and doing anything the former guy even remotely suggests that they do. And they do it without question, because in their minds, they're following orders. And they make that abundantly clear. I mean, look at what happened on January 6th when some of them stormed the Capitol. Did all the people who supported the former guy do that and believe it was right? Certainly not. But enough did and do that it's something to be very wary of. I think also, and I don't think this matters if you are liberal, conservative, somewhere in the middle, or the extreme of either one, where you get your information from is going to influence how you behave. Therefore, it would be naive to think that information given to you is never manipulated to elicit a certain response from you. Now, Stanley Milgram said the following, and I thought this was spot on. Control the manner in which a man interprets his world, and you have gone a long way toward controlling his behavior. That is why ideology, an attempt to interpret the condition of man, is always a prominent feature of revolutions, wars, and other circumstances in which individuals are called upon to perform extraordinary action. So I thought about the church I grew up in and the mindset of, we were told to take back the nation for Christ. We were given information, and I suspect a lot of white evangelical churches still do this. We were given information that told us we were persecuted, we were marginalized, that if the world around us could have their way, being a Christian would be against the law, that the other, meaning people who don't share our beliefs, were the enemy, and we needed to fear them. And if we allowed, quote, special interest groups, aka the LGBTQ plus community, to have their way, then we will be destroyed, and we will have lost our own culture and our own our own foundation to stand on, because everything that we believe in and stand for would be made illegal by these others who wanted to rise to positions of power almost solely for the purpose of silencing us. And that's what we were told again and again and again. And it absolutely changed the way I saw the world and I saw other people who didn't share my beliefs. I don't think that's any different than what is happening today. And now we have the influence of social media. We have people who present themselves as more qualified than they actually are to speak on a topic. I'll be the first to tell you, I'm just giving my opinions. I'm not qualified. I am not in any position of being able to say definitively one thing or another. I'm just sharing my experiences. But because of the filter that's offered by social media, of not having to be personally present with the people you're talking to and not having to really take a lot of responsibility for what you say and the consequences of what you say, a lot of people are espousing ideas that are downright dangerous. And that includes not just what the right wing does. I think that we've known for a long time that the right wing is dangerous. White nationalists, white supremacists, racist, sexist, etc. But there are people on the opposite end of the spectrum, the leftists, who will say, eat the rich. And they actually, they mean it. They really want, according to what some have said, they really seem to want the people who are wealthy to be punished to the point of oblivion for being wealthy. Both of those extremes are being fed by information that is meant to elicit a certain behavior from these people. And it happens all across the spectrum. It's not just one group or another doing this. This happens all across the spectrum. So what can you do? First of all, be aware that it's easy to look at something like the Holocaust and you can see how, people, quote, obeying orders had horrific outcomes. And it's easy to look at that and say, I would never participate in that. And you very well might not have participated. I don't know. But I think it's important to note that even in the United States, we have a history that speaks to the willingness of people to participate in heinous activities under the guise of being obedient. Stanley Milgram said in his book, "The importation and enslavement of millions of black people, the destruction of the American Indian population, the internment of Japanese Americans, the use of napalm against civilians in Vietnam, all are harsh policies that originated in the authority of a democratic nation and were responded to with the expected obedience." So I think that it would be naive to think I could never be part of something like that. What can you do though? So Stanley Milgram also said, it may be that we are puppets controlled by the strings of society, but at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness, and perhaps our awareness is the first step toward liberation. So yes, we are being manipulated by the information we receive and how we receive it. We are being, no matter what you use as your source of information, that source can absolutely influence how you see the world and can condition you to see the world in a certain way so that you have a certain response that they're looking for. You can be obedient to that without even realizing that's what you're doing. But because we have the awareness and because we have the ability to step back and objectively look at what is happening and how we're responding to it, if we are so inclined to do that, and you have to get to that place of wanting to see it first. We also have the ability to choose not to comply, to say, I'm just not going to be part of this. How we get our information and how we check that information matters. Blindly accepting something, and I think headlines, that is a big one. Most people don't read the article. If you post something on the internet with this and headlines are designed to get you to click. That's what they want. They want an emotional response from you so that you will click on the article and read it. Most headlines are somewhat misleading, if not entirely misleading, about the content of the article. And since most people only read headlines, unfortunately, people are running around out there with all kinds of misinformation about things and reacting accordingly because they didn't bother to check their facts. This manipulation that happens in our society, and it's not just the media that does it, it's all around us. There is social engineering happening all the time. Once you become aware of it, you have a responsibility to respond to it in a way that is, it coincides with your personal conscience. If you are participating in something that is actively harming people, you don't get to just say, well, I read it in such and such a newspaper, or I saw it on this website, so I acted accordingly. You are responsible. I am responsible personally for my actions, and so are you. So when you look at the Nuremberg trials and the trials in Jerusalem, and you hear I was just following orders, my takeaway is this. First, be aware that you are being manipulated. Okay, you don't have to, quote, follow orders. Wherever those orders might be coming from, whatever your political or religious persuasion might be, someone is giving you orders. So you have to be aware of that. And secondly, it is on you and me to weigh these things out and determine, does acting on this based on the information I was given mesh well with what my conscience is telling me? And if it doesn't, then I have a responsibility to not act on it. I have a responsibility to not perpetuate the cycle of harm that has been started here, and it can end with me. Now, would there have been consequences for, these Nazi officers defying orders? Absolutely, there would have been. No question about that. Does that justify, though, what they did? I don't think it does. And I think we have to be mindful of the fact that it was so easy to manipulate these people into compliance. At the end of the documentary, Obedience to Authority, Stanley Milgram basically says, if our humble little experiment, he speaks much more eloquently than I do, by the way. If our humble experiment could get people to inflict pain on someone else just because they were told to do it, how much more the people of a nation who are under who are subject to the influence of a government that has far more resources at hand. And it's a valid question. It's a good question to ask, and it should make you stop and think. It should make you stop and ask, where am I getting my information from? What is it asking of me? And can I, in good conscience, comply? That's not to say that change is easy. That's not to say that recognizing these things is easy. And it's also not to say that everybody has the resources mentally, emotionally, financially, and so forth to be in defiance of the orders being given. And when I say orders, I'm not talking about explicit orders. I'm talking about the subtle suggestions that we find everywhere we turn that have a certain expectation of us and expects compliance. And there are consequences to pay for not complying. I have definitely felt consequences since leaving the white evangelical circle I grew up in. There have been penalties to pay. And I would imagine that's true no matter what circle you're traveling in, and no matter who you're defying, someone is going to have a problem with you not obeying, and they are going to make it clear that there's a penalty for your lack of obedience. So I thought this was interesting, especially now in a time where there are so many influences all around us, so many people who are trying to condition us to behave in a certain way. We have to be mindful. We have to be aware. And we have to make a choice. Sometimes, multiple times a day, every day. Who are we listening to? What do they want from us? And are we going to obey? And if we do, what's the consequence? And if we don't, what's the consequence? Because whatever happens, it's on us. Nobody else is going to take responsibility for it. I remember when the former guy was in office and people thought they could do all these awful things because he had suggested that they do them and that he would issue pardons. And they quickly found out that's not how this works. And so it is in life. We are responsible for our choices, and we can't just say we were following orders when we do something that inflicts harm on people and communities. So anyway, I hope that was informative for you. I'd love to know your thoughts. because I think this is it's an interesting subject. The question of obedience to authority, I think, is relevant today. Oh, I also thought, you know, the Chauvin trial was not, it was, you know, it had the outcome I wanted. The defense a lot of people used for him and for other officers is they were just doing what they were trained to do. Is that the same thing as just following orders? Because they were conditioned at some point to see everyone around them as a threat and to eliminate that threat if they felt the need to. And this is not something I fully fleshed out, but I wonder, where does just following orders come into play there? And where does personal choice come into play? Or is it some of both? Are they just doing what they were trained to do, as so many have said? Or are they actively choosing to be murderous, awful people? And regardless of whether it's the former or the latter, what does it say about people who are attracted to that type of career, where they can follow orders and the orders are shoot to kill, and then if they choose to follow through on that, they're told they don't have to accept any personal responsibility? I don't know, it's very interesting. I haven't fully thought that out yet, but it's interesting to me. I'd love to know your thoughts. Anyway, have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Be good to yourself. Be good to each other. Don't shit on yourselves or anyone else. Be safe out there. Wear masks. Practice social distancing. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and it ain't going away anytime soon. So be a responsible citizen, please, because you're responsible for your own actions and the consequences thereof. No one else is. All right, I'll talk to you again very soon. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.